So you are Anton Cebalo. Did I pronounce that right?
Oh, it's Cebalo.
Cebalo. So there's no ch. It's okay.
Yeah, it's yeah, like I don't know, TS like Cebalo.
Okay.
Yeah,
I
Cebalo.
I
Yeah.
overdid it. I should have just.
Yeah, some people say Ceballo because they think it's Spanish, but it's not. Yeah.
Oh yeah. Wouldn't that have two L's?
Yeah, they think maybe they think it's a mistake or something on the I get telemarketers in Spanish a lot actually.
Oh really?
Yeah.
They they assume that much from the name and send you a.
Yeah, it's bizarre. Yeah, I know. And it's funny because this is like totally just a side tangent, but my mom went to the dentist and she was Spanish, the dentist, and she was telling my mom how she shouldn't be afraid of using her real last name, which was Ceballo. And my mom started laughing. Yeah, it's weird. It's weird like that. Anyway, yeah.
Cool. So yeah, you are New York based, I believe.
Yeah, I'm in Queens, New York.
Okay. Oh, AOC's area.
Actually, I'm right there. I'm in Astoria, which is pretty much her district.
Okay.
Yeah.
Uh, Yeah, I've been to New York about five times, but each time was like, dreadfully brief. Just like 2 days each, so still haven't seen too much. But I'm in San Francisco and I'm amazed by just how small where I'm at really is. I mean, Brooklyn alone is bigger than this city.
Yeah, for sure. But I'm a big Queens advocate, you know. I feel like this is kind of where it's very like kind of old, like classic New York kind of actually residential people, you know? Like
Yeah,
if you're looking for that real New York kind of in terms of life and food and community and everything else, a lot of it is in Queens. I mean, Brooklyn is, as it's been changing a lot last 20 years, it's kind of actually a lot of people are moving out of Brooklyn now into Queens because of the rent and everything else.
okay. Yeah, I visited a friend who was right in that kind of border zone where Brooklyn butts up against Queens, and like George
Yeah.
Costanza's house apparently is right in there somewhere.
Okay, yeah, that might have been Ridgewood or Bushwick or out there.
Yeah, I guess I did see some of the real New York because I went to a White Castle and no gentrified brewery or anything in like Red Hook or
Oh,
whatever.
wow.
Um,
Okay, gotcha.
yeah, so you have a Substack, and how do you pronounce it's something Latin titled, I believe.
Yeah, it's a Novum newsletter,
Okay,
and Novum stands for new in Latin. It's kind of an exploration into like developments unique to our time. I like discussing history, culture, politics, things that I think strike me as particular to the time we're living in.
yeah, you have a kind of a high level zeitgeist focus, and that's kind of where I'm coming from too, and I find that very interesting. And of course, I pinged you originally to discuss probably your most well-known piece, I believe, called "The Social Recession," and which I read a version of in the Guardian, and I know that's edited somewhat, um, but nonetheless, it's still quite lengthy and substantial. The Guardian version I read, I know it's on your Substack as well, um, and so it kind of touches on a lot of things, all of the various aspects of life that are contributing to increasing kind of loneliness and atomization. Do you want to kind of give an overview of that article? And
Yeah, sure. So initially, the reason I wrote it was frankly because of personal, experiences I've had talking to people and realizing that a lot of people, frankly, their friend groups seem to be getting smaller, and I feel like atomization is definitely something that's been felt more and more. The pandemic really put that front and center to kind of deepen, but the trend was already forming, at least a decade before that. It started to really accelerate. And in the piece, which I didn't really expect to catch on like it did, but it really got people's attention because everybody, relates to it in some way. And I tried to understand the problem through looking at a few different metrics. And it's mainly inspired by a book that came out in 2000, which has become a very common political science book taught in universities, Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam. And that book detailed how community life in America really declined from the 1960s onward. And when it came out, it was hotly debated. People weren't sure if this trend was here to stay. But what's remarkable for, if you look at the actual numbers, is that uh, Putnam published this in 2000, but if you look at the stats ever since he published the book, I mean, it's become abundantly clear that all the metrics he used have really gone off a cliff. And by that, I mean, general metrics of community life, church attendance, friendship circles, involvement in third places that aren't work or home related, and also levels of trust, which have really eroded since the 1970s, and as of 2022, are recorded to be at all-time low across an average of all American institutions. And I think all of this comes together in a general new kind of sociability and orientation people have towards not just the state, but also each other. There's America has transitioned from being a high trust to a low trust society. And this has come at the expense of, I think, collective political aspirations, also friendships. Generally, friendship circles are smaller. But in general, it's led to, I think, less conviviality and creativity and culture and politics and ingenuity in other areas of life. And it's kind of that fundamental thing that's like the elephant in the room that I think needs to be, historicized and talked about and understood, why this trend is happening. And that's what I tried to unpack in this piece. Although it wasn't a historical piece, I just tried to present the information. But more and more, I've been reading about, what are the catalysts for this development, and that's what I've been researching recently, actually. And I plan to do some follow-up work on that in the coming months.
Cool. Okay. Yeah, I remember when Bowling Alone came out, and so it came out in 2000, and so it was obviously a big subject of conversation in the early 2000s. And I was a libertarian at that time, and I remember a Reason magazine article challenging Bowling Alone by saying, for example, that UK people don't join bowling leagues, but that's because that's an old-fashioned thing. They're just doing other things now. They're getting together to play video games or something.
Right. Yeah. There was this optimism. Well, first there was a denial that it was happening.
Right.
So that's the first thing. And the second thing also, which I found, which I've been actually reading about, also just looking online for like through the like Google, looking at past articles published before 2010. And there was a lot of optimism that post 9/11 would create a new patriotic community, actually. Like clubs are on the rise, civic participation is going to rebound. Like it's weird how they were trying to throw everything at the wall. Like we will deny this is happening. The internet, maybe patriotism, maybe something's going to help revive the community. But like none of it stuck because there's no places to congregate that would allow for community life to flourish like it did, That's kind of the crux of what I'm trying to understand is like, where do you go how do you invigorate a community when the third places that would make it up have so eroded? Like they're not really there for people to congregate like they used to. And that's a shame.
Yeah, I've even heard the kind of a classical liberal, or I should say libertarian. Classical liberals not quite as dogmatic as the libertarians, but the libertarian would say, well, how can you say that trust is at an all-time low? I mean, people are getting into strangers' cars now because of Uber. Uber helped us trust each other, which
Right.
is sort of
Yeah.
a very kind of example of community or anything approaching a bowling league, because it's just so clearly instrumental and
That's super interesting because I remember I was watching Adam Curtis's documentary. Obviously you know him, right?
I began to, he's British, I believe, right? British.
Yeah. I recommend him really highly. He's
I,
influenced me a lot. Yeah,
I,
sorry.
I found out about him through the influence of kind of I don't know, Mark Fisher style British
Yes.
leftism, which a friend of mine, Hagulian, also kind of comes from that background, and I'm still getting familiar with that stuff. So I'm not that familiar with Adam Curtis.
Yeah. It's not. I highly recommend checking him out. All his documentaries are on YouTube. Amazing stuff. But what I wanted to say is that he has this documentary called Bitter Lake, where he talks about the failed American effort to remake Afghanistan. And in the documentary, he talks a bit about how when they couldn't establish the nation building, they just they just let the market run wild. They thought that would create trust. Like maybe the market can create trust where we can't, create it genuinely through other, community means. So there is this like thought like, okay, we're a low trust society, but maybe the market, can mediate and we don't need trust. We can just have market relations be the arbiter of community life. And that to me is a very dog eat dog environment that is not conducive to, collective dreams really or aspirations. It's kind of the, what you do when you have no other option or when things have, you've basically given up to forces beyond your control, basically.
The one thing I will say in favor of that is that it does seem to sort of stave off the complete opposite of a kind of positive fellow feeling style communal vibe, and that is people attacking each other and things going to shit in the street through sort of a kind of ethnic based civil warfare or something, because people really are too focused on their personal livelihood for that to even happen too. So let's say the dark side, what they used to call the dark side of democracy or of communalism, violence toward the outside group. So markets do actually mitigate that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I think that's just not really good enough. I mean, there is something happening here that liberalism didn't really foresee, like the total erosion of any kind of minimal positive sense of community. I mean, just the fact that we're not going to descend into some kind of Rwandan warfare. It doesn't really give me much solace. So.
Yeah, no, it's a really low bar. I totally agree. And the thing about it too is that I don't really think liberalism used to be very intertwined with this sense of community ethic. This laissez-faire attitude, I think, is relatively new, like historically. I mean, liberalism used to be rooted in, clubs and those kind of organizations. I mean, there were sports leagues, at the height of liberalism. I'm talking about like, pre-World War I, where liberalism was like really engaged in this kind of like civic, we're going to remake a new citizen type, thinking. Like liberalism, tried to create a community life out of a ethic that it felt was rooted in, Enlightenment, rational values, let's say. And I feel as though now there's no expectation really for the citizen. Like the citizen has been relegated to, I don't know. I really don't think there's much of the public. There's not really much of a space for even political, like it's easy to say, oh, the public is just getting apathetic, but there really is no like avenue for them to get engaged because politics has become so separate from people's actual lived life, and that separation I think is really the crux of a lot of problems.
Yeah, there's a kind of freedom to ignore politics that we enjoy here. I say enjoy only because up until very recently, I was sort of focused on the preventing the worst of human atrocities, where you're primarily focused on too much government or ethnic conflict. But that there's a certain blind spot of liberalism starting to see now, which to me sort of suggests greater political involvement in a way that Americans, with their kind of very siloed existence even before the social recession, are not particularly sensitive to appreciating, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, there's been I don't know if you've encountered this. There's been a lot of talk recently, like pieces I've read talking about how why does everything seem so politicized and yet there's no actual community, like there's no mass politics, but somehow everything is politicized. Like there's no collective action, even though we're inundated constantly with partisanship and this really, intense politicization of all aspects of life. And I think that's kind of gets at the crux of what, like the social recession is one component, but the thing is that if you think about decline of sociability and then you consider politics, what's weird nowadays is that all of the, like politics used to represent a community, basically. Let's say you would essentially from your political leanings, be they Christian, let's say Christian Democrats in Germany or something, or socialists in Italy, or there was in the mass party model, politics gave you a community and also an identity in a way. But nowadays we don't really have, we have politicization, but without the actual politics of community. Like we have these maybe outbursts like happened in 2020, but that dissipated very quickly and did not produce any mass momentum. All it really did was allow for this like explosion that didn't really, that wasn't really, it produced effects, but I don't think it really had a, if it had happened, let's say 50 years ago, there would definitely be more of a mass element. It would have a staying power as a faction within a political, situation. But now it's kind of dissipated. And I don't know. You have any thoughts on that? I'm just kind of riffing here. I'm thinking this out as I'm talking, actually.
Well, it occurs to me that even a desire to be more political, communal, and to sort of escape the kind of hyper individualist existence, if too many people have different conceptions of what that looks like, it just ends up looking like to everyone else more individualism. So if you can't even agree on how to be communal and to fight individualism, everyone's got their, let's say, their own idiosyncratic socialism, then you scale that up and it just looks like more individualism because no one can coordinate. So
Right. Yeah.
it's unfortunate.
Yeah, I think maybe it'd be better to ground this in something more concrete. So, recently I read, I'm a big fan of Christopher Lasch. I like his work a lot.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of his essays. His most recent book, Revolt of the Elites, is like a collection of essays, which he talks, among other things, the decline of American community life, but also civic participation and how democracy.
That was you say most recent book. That relatively most recent, right? I think that was early '90s. He died.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that's what I meant. The one before he died in late '90s. I think he passed away.
Oh.
Yeah. So he wrote Revolt of the Elites, which was published after his death, but it was the last thing he wrote. It was a collection of essays. And in the 90s, he was already talking about this concept that was popularized by another social scientist called Ray Oldenburg. And the concept was third places, which I mentioned, I think, a little earlier. And those are places that are not work or home. So essentially like a bar or a shop, maybe you hang out. It could be a place that you go to where generally there's no expectation of rank. There's a certain spontaneity about it. There's regulars, but there's also people, maybe, friendships you wouldn't expect to make that happen there. There's a bunch of other characteristics which Oldenburg lists. But what Christopher Lasch talks about is that he thinks that the reason, and he's writing in a time in the 90s when political participation is at the lowest point since World War II. So the election of 1996 with Clinton, turnout was something like 50% or something of eligible voters. And so Lasch is writing around in a time when participation is at its low point since World War II, and he relates this to the decline of third places. And he says, well, a lot of these third places where you would normally go to congregate, to meet friends, regulars, after work, perhaps you'd go and hang out. Those kind of spaces are integral to a healthy public and political life generally. And he recounts this story of a letter actually that he quotes in the book from a woman who grew up in the Great Depression, and how she hanging around her neighborhood, let's say at the wherever kids would go hang out. I'm guessing it would probably be, maybe they would play pool, or maybe they would go play hopscotch. I don't know what, but regardless, as a kid, you're hanging around the neighborhood and you hear things from adults and things around you. And in her letter, she talked about how growing up as a kid, it was from experiencing the, spontaneous social sphere that she got an appreciation for politics, philosophy, economics, things that she wouldn't have ever heard of at home because her family was not, of that mindset. But being out into the world, she was exposed with these ideas that ultimately made her the person that she became. That's what she explained in the letter. And I thought that was pretty much a nice summation of why these kind of spaces are important, because not only do they allow you, they allow you to experience something beyond yourself. And in this day and age, when algorithms reflect things back at us, that's like the most important thing to self-development and cultivation, like experiencing something that's not a reflection of you, but is just that you're just absorbing because you're in an environment that's exposing you to new things. And that only happens in these third places, and places that are not often not home and work. Um, yeah.
Yeah, there's an economist named, he died some time ago as well, Albert Hirschman, and he talked about voice versus exit. Um, I think what you're sort of talking about now, these institutions that are not workplace or your home, were those the two that? What was his dichotomy there again?
Yeah. So a third place is a place that's not a home or work.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
So these institutions that have been disappearing, the bowling leagues and the Elks Lodge and things like that, which is it's already sort of Elks Lodge is a somewhat specific example that I think is tied to veterans, but be that as it may, voice versus exit, being in a position such that you can't avoid other people's opinions and you learn from their point of view, you appreciate where they're coming from. There's no pressure now to remain in such a situation. In the voice versus exit dichotomy, there, people are exiting rather than sticking around and inputting their voice and listening to other voices. So whatever kind of simulacrum of community that exists increasingly online, the second it feels uncomfortable, you can bail and go find some other new online community. So it doesn't have the same sort of communal pressure to understand another's perspective and to sort of align your interests with theirs over time. So I think that's a big drawback to what we're seeing now. It's a highly consumer centric version of community. Community with a small c, a really debauched version of community, in fact. So the lack of consumer freedom, the lack of easy exit is actually important to having a community minded perspective.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. And the thing about the internet generally is that it's more of an imitation of a third place. Last year, this was trending. Every media outlet was talking about we need third places. It was in the Atlantic, New York Times, New Yorker. They're all writing about we need third places. It was like a big buzzword last year for some reason. And it went viral on TikTok. There was like somebody talking about where did our third places go? And he gave like an explainer. The video has like millions of views or whatever. And everybody was talking about third places. Where are the third places? And oftentimes the comments were what interested me the most, because the comments were like, the internet is my third place. You know, like I don't have community life out there, but online I do. But the thing is that the online is an imitation of that. It's not the real thing. And that's because, like you said, you can exit whenever you feel like. And also a real third place, a real like embodied, like physical third place does not produce distrust. That's the difference. And demonstrably, which I demonstrated in my social recession piece, which has been a trend since the 70s, like trust has declined precipitously since the 70s, and since the mass adoption of the internet has completely nosedived. So if the internet was a community building exercise, a real third place, I really don't think we would see this trend. It would probably benefit, social trust, but it hasn't. It's accelerated the trend, and that's because it's online. I mean, there's really when you're disembodied, you can. It's quite easy to not. I mean, I rarely ever do I encounter like I don't know, like just browse Twitter and you'll understand what you'll get the idea of how the internet isn't really conducive to community life, you know.
Yeah, it does have some superficial trappings of community life. For instance, what you say is being read and being observed by other people. But getting anyone to, I don't know. People have described being online is sort of the worst aspects of a small town. None of the positives, all the downsides. There was a Meghan McArdle, kind of neoliberal writer, kind of cut her teeth in the 2000s. That she's talked about that as well. It's prying eyes with only a kind of vindictiveness, calling out people who are straying from opinion, from the sort of consensus that's emerged in that community, with no chance of redemption, even if you did acknowledge that you were wrong and want to somehow get back in the good graces. So it's all downside, no upside to real community.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not even sure the downsides are anything like actual community. It's just like it's so superficial. It's merely communication based, and it's not face to face. It's merely words on a screen that another member of your so-called community you're observing, right? So.
Yeah, and I think I kind of end my piece on the social recession. I end my piece by talking a bit about like what kind of person does this create? Like you look at the statistics, right? The especially the latest one that came out, I think it was 2022. And you look at the people who claim they have no friends whatsoever. So that's it's 2021, and that people who claim they have no close friends amongst men is 15%. Amongst women, it's around 10%. And obviously, it's higher amongst millennials and Gen Z and stuff like that, and that generation. But you wonder, like, for these people that they feel they have no friends whatsoever, and they're kind of invisible in many ways, like what kind of resentment does that produce? It naturally produces resentment. Like I understand, and that resentment, as that number of people who feel that way grows, which I think is already demonstrated by, a lot of the trends I mentioned in my piece, how is this new individual going to see the world and also demand, what is he or she going to demand of the world politically, um, and how will it be reflected in at the ballot box, or how will it be reflected in other aspects of society? And that's what I think is we're kind of at this inflection point where the state is mostly made up of people who are not of this, who are not socialized in this way. The average age in Congress and the state is over 60. And as those people generally, over the course of the next decade or two are on their way out, you're going to have the dominant cohort be the digitally native, socialized online. And like, how does that square with how politics works now? We're already kind of seeing the tug of it on the national level in some way, that kind of resentment from feeling invisible, perhaps a projection from not having community life projected onto politics. A lot of that I think is going to get, frankly, just weirder and more intense. That kind of parasocial attachment, because people lack it in their own life. They're going to project it onto, politics or some kind of, those things are going to intensify. And that's where I think we're due for some serious turbulence in that respect.
Yeah. The parasocial nature of being online, that's something that didn't really hit home for me until you guessed it, 2000, or excuse me, 2020, with COVID. I had never watched YouTube reaction videos, for instance, where I watched someone watching something, and
Yeah, right. Yeah.
ended up I ended up doing that during the period of isolation in 2020. And I've been watching that stuff ever since. And honestly, about 80% of what I watch now is YouTube. Not all reaction, but it's a huge portion of it. So I'm watching strangers watch movies that I know, that I grew up with, just over and over again. It's really kind of sad. But
Yeah, I've gone down this rabbit hole too, where I'm binging off reaction videos, basically people reacting to things that I love. Oh,
right,
what's gonna be their their takeaway?
right. And how many times do I need to watch someone watch Terminator? It's really pretty sad.
Yeah, yeah,
And so
yeah.
yeah. So that's something I've seen sort of I already used the term hit home, but I saw in a personal way beginning about 2 years ago that it was COVID that sort of tipped me over the edge there, and I'm sure a lot of people have similar stories.